These liberal senators want boys in girls' sports. I'm the father of 2 daughters. They want men in your daughter's and my daughter's locker room. And you know, they can't even define what a woman is. But let me tell you something. Back in Montana, we know the difference between a bull and a cow.
Hi, I'm Ana Marie Cox with 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We have 69 days until the election, and I'm going to do it, Parker. Nice. Okay. Parker Molloy is a newsletter haver. Her newsletter is called The Present Age, and it is a lot of media criticism. I would say that that's your thing. And so I want to ask you, so what's happening lately that's really caught your attention in the way that we talk about this election?
Sure. So, you know those undecided voter panels that all the networks do, where they talk to people who are oblivious about what's going on in the world, and sadly, those are the people who are going to decide what's going to happen. You know, so CNN had one of those during the DNC, and it turns out that one of the people who was on the panel wasn't so much an undecided voter as he was a gigantic Trump fan. And which that was something that someone went through all of this guy's social media stuff, which is honestly a little creepy. Going through some random guy's social media stuff to see if he's ever said pro-Trump things. But it turns out that he said a lot of pro-Trump things. Like he was upset that Mike Pence didn't overturn the election. He's retweeting pictures of Trump's mugshot, stuff like that. And CNN, for whatever reason, because they asked him if he was willing to listen to Harris's speech and go into it with an open mind, and then he could say who he supports for president. They had him in there, and so there was this focus group of undecided voters, and I think there were 8 of them. 6 of them went from being undecided to saying they were going to vote for Harris. One of them is still undecided, and then this guy, when they asked him, he's like, "I think I'm going to vote for Trump," which was clear all along. So I wrote about that recently.
And I think that's worth talking about because it is an example of the fetishization of the undecided voter, right?
Yes.
Like this feeling like it's important to highlight the undecided voter because that's the person you have to reach, right? And it sort of is, you could do a / undecided / independent voter. And there aren't actually that many of them. No. He's a perfect example, right? Like people who call themselves independent or undecided, especially people who call themselves independent, generally like kind of lean one way or another. And it's such a thing that this happens like fairly often.
Yeah. Well, with, in the piece that I wrote with, it included 2 more examples of times when CNN had either misidentified someone or not provided the right amount of context for someone on one of their panels. For instance, there was one that was like, here are some Republican voters and what they think about, it was something that Trump did, or, it was the Kavanaugh hearings. It was responding to the allegations against Brett Kavanaugh at the time. So that was 2018. And it turns out that those weren't just like regular Republican voters. They were Republican political operatives and candidates. So like that's like supercharged Republican voters. And so this happens a lot on TV, and I guess it makes for compelling TV, but I don't know that it actually helps inform the rest of us. You know, it's like we're watching a show. We're watching a TV show. It's a reality show. It's not so much reality as it is a show.
I think what to me this reminds me of, and we've had, I think, a turn into this with so-called fact checking as well. is there was this moment when Trump was elected and when Trump's fascism started to really become obvious, where I saw mainstream media kind of lean into the fact like, oh no, like we're in danger because of this movement and we need to take a position, at the very least, a position for openness. And we need to acknowledge that one of the sides in this debate, one of the sides in this contest for power. And now that I think about it, thinking of it as a contest for power is so much more accurate than debate. That these are two powers that have interests, right? So there is this moment, and I think best exemplified when the Washington Post said that their motto was "Democracy dies in darkness." And then also like CNN had those like Apple versus banana ads, which are kind of stupid. And I think democracy dies in darkness is also kind of stupid. But it was saying this is an adversarial relationship to a certain kind of power, right? And that just seems to have like...
Yeah, it seems to have kind of gone by the wayside. I mean, you have was it David Zaslav, the head of Warner Brothers Discovery, who that's CNN's parent company. You know, someone asked him about the election, and he basically he endorsed Trump without endorsing Trump. He was like, well, we'd like, you know, as long as it's a pro-business administration that's not hostile to mergers and acquisitions. And it's just like, well, given that one of the things that the Biden administration actually is done pretty okay on is like antitrust stuff, and given that Warner Brothers Discovery has been the target of some of the antitrust stuff, it was clear what he was saying. It's clear he was saying, I would very much like it to be Donald Trump in the Oval Office come January, for business reasons. And I think that that's something that gets lost in a lot of this discussion, you know, that these corporate entities are corporate entities. You know, they're trying to stay afloat, trying to stay alive. And I think that there's this idea that they worry that if Trump gets in office and they were harsh to him, that he will punish those companies. And they're probably not wrong, because that's something that he did during his first term in office. He would try to hold up deals that were going through if he didn't like who was involved with them. You know, that was something that I remember CNN was talked about, you know, during his administration. And I just don't think there's that fear when it comes to, you know, if Kamala Harris gets elected, she's not going to go on like a rampage attacking the New York Times or CNN for not giving her positive coverage. And so I think that fear kind of helps nudge the scales in Trump's direction a little bit. And during the DNC with fact checking was a little bit of a mess during the DNC. To put it lightly, you know, there would be something that would be like, well, Donald Trump, he didn't exactly say that he wouldn't, you know, accept the results of the election. He just wouldn't, you know, say one way or the other if he would. And it's just like,
and ignoring like, well, there was actually a time when he didn't accept the results of the election. Like,
well, and that was what got me. There was a Washington Post reporter who was doing some of the, you know, the live fact checking of Harris's speech, and I think it was Harris's speech, someone at the DNC, and the comment was that Trump said he wouldn't accept the results of the election, and the response was something along the lines of, he didn't say that. He's never said one way or the other. This is false. And it's one of those things where that reporter, it turns out, was on like the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for January 6th coverage. So it's like, you were there. You were front and center for this. But it's fact checking. It's
What's
it's
interesting to
a
me,
lot of editorializing.
yeah, and I think what's important for people to understand is that when that kind of fake both siderism, or it's not fake both siderism, when the both siderism happens and there's this reluctance to call out actual misinformation or to kind of put their thumb on the scale of giving the benefit of the doubt, what that does is misinform readers.
Yes.
Like, what that does is keep readers from making their own informed decision. Like, it's not just like, oh, we media critics have a problem with them saying this. It's that you're keeping people ignorant.
Yeah, I mean, and that was something that I wrote about last week, about how the average person, when they look at this, they just want to know if what they said was true generally, not whether the specific words were, there was another comment that someone said, under Project 2025, they would create a national abortion monitoring coordinator or something like that. And I think it was PolitiFact was like, well, actually, that position would be known as the politically motivated women's health or something. And basically it was like, yes, this is true, but the actual title is not National Abortion Monitoring Coordinator.
Right. Yeah.
So it's all this stuff that it just obfuscates the what's actually being said and what people are hearing.
It's the performance of fact checking.
Exactly. And it goes back when I was at Media Matters, back in, I think I wrote this in it was in 2020 that I wrote this at Media Matters. It was a piece about PolitiFact, and I kind of looked at how it was balanced when it came to how they judged Obama versus how they judged Trump, because they have their like Trumpometer, Obama meter, Biden meter, whatever. And some of the things that they would give Trump, like promises kept on, because that was how they'd rank it. They would say promise kept, promise stalled, promise broken, something like that. And there was one campaign promise that Trump made that was that every store would be saying Merry Christmas. And obviously that just didn't happen. And the way that they say that they measure these things is supposed to be like it's to the word. It's like whether or not he actually did exactly what he said. And they gave him a promise kept on not cutting Social Security and Medicare, because they said, well, he didn't cut it. He only tried to cut it. Congress stopped him. But they gave him a promise kept on his every store will be saying Merry Christmas promise, which was really sad and goofy.
What was the basis of that? Did they do a random sampling of stores? Did they?
They looked at. I believe that they looked at his social media feed, and they noticed that he said Merry Christmas and didn't once say Happy Holidays during his presidency, and they said that counted. Which I guess.
Let's talk about the DNC some more, because there were a lot of things that didn't like. I'm gonna go ahead and say, like, I enjoyed the pageantry of the DNC. I found it inspiring. It had a completely different feel than other conventions. It wasn't the faults of it or the criticisms I have of it are kind of what didn't get talked about more than what did get talked about.
Right.
And I know there was something that, and let's just say it, like the absence of talking about, or very small kind of portion of the entire conversation was about the threats to trans people, which is ironic because the GOP is basically basing their entire like campaign on protecting us from the trans ideology.
The trans ideology.
What I almost want to ask you. So, Parker, what is the trans ideology?
I mean, it's basically just being trans. You know, it's a nice way to talk about when people are like gender ideology, trans ideology, all of this. It's just a way to basically turn existence into a political point of view. And because you can disagree with a political point of view, you can't disagree with someone's existence. So if you can take people and turn them into just politics, like, you know, when I first, you know, was first coming to terms with my gender, I don't think I was thinking politics. I was not, you know, I was not like a 12-year-old kid who was just like, I'm going to get really into this ideology, a word that I definitely knew at age 12, sure. You know, but yeah, to your point, trans issues really didn't come up during the DNC. There were a few passing references like here and there to trans people. There was when the president of the Human Rights Campaign gave a speech, she mentioned something about trans students not being allowed to use the bathrooms or something along those lines, which is like, that's great. But one thing that I just saw that I want to kind of read back to you that I saw today about this was from Raquel Willis, who she's a trans woman and an activist, and she's great. She wrote this on Threads. She wrote, "The DNC failed to counter the anti-trans crusade of the Republicans, but even worse, it failed to connect how restricting abortion and IVF access overlaps with restricting gender-affirming care. We all deserve bodily autonomy and self-determination. We must discuss reproductive justice with the nuance it deserves. Trans men, trans-masc folks, non-binary folk need abortion access. Queer and trans couples need IVF access, and cis folks need access gender-affirming care, often with considerable ease." And that's, I think, the core of it. You've got all you there. It's not that there needed to be all of these other additions to what was being talked about. It was just that trans people and how trans people relate to a lot of these other you know, a lot of these other issues, whether it's IVF or whether it's, you know, bodily autonomy generally, it just wasn't talked about. And, you know, right now there's really a pretty gigantic attack going on trans rights. It's been going for years. Just yesterday or just earlier this week, Florida, which tried to implement restrictions on banning gender-affirming care for trans youth and restricting it for trans adults. In a court case, a Trump-appointed judge allowed that to go into effect earlier this week. So restrictions on trans adults' health care. So these things are happening, and they're happening pretty quickly. You know, they're happening now, and for it just to not be talked about while the Republicans talk about it constantly is a little worrying. I think that, you know, some people were a little upset that there wasn't a trans speaker at the DNC, and I think that while that sort of, you know, representation can be nice, I would have been fine with if just it was something that was brought up and discussed. You know, rather than the representation element of it, you know, just these are people. We need to protect these people. They're under attack. You know, that was definitely one of the topics that just didn't get a lot of coverage because they had to give, you know, room for a half dozen Republicans to speak.
I think there's sort of two pieces of like two criticisms. I mean, there's might be more, but I'm thinking of two criticisms of the lack of that conversation. And one is what you've mentioned, which is there is a direct line between restricting access to gender-affirming care to the exclusion of trans people from reproductive care to those restrictions affecting cis people, right? The 19th, which is a publication that that specializes in women's issues and also trans and non-binary issues. Great publication. Actually based here in Texas, which is ironic.
There you
go. Or you could say great, because we have a lot of those issues here. But they're doing a series this week that the point of the series is to make that connection between when the Republicans talk about restricting trans ideology, that has a ripple effect to everything. Because what they're doing when they say that is an attempt to institute a very specific vision of gender norms. They are, in fact, it's in Project 2025, which is they believe, or they are saying, that schools should teach, there's no gray area, that the proper family structure is a man and a woman, and that there is like no room, and it's also like a traditionally gendered man and woman, and that teachers who say anything otherwise should be classified as sex offenders.
Yeah, pretty intense. That's scary. And you know, there was one of the stories from the 19th you talked about a teacher who tried to stand up for one of her students who was being bullied, and because the student had the student's parents were, I think, either two gay men or two lesbian women. It was something like that, and that teacher got yelled at or got in trouble at school and was basically told, like, you can't do this. You can't stand up for your students like this. You can't say that all families deserve respect, which is scary. And I think we kind of saw how the anti-trans crusade kind of is always expanding who it's targeting. We saw this during the Olympics. You know, Iman Khalif was a boxer from Algeria, and she just out of nowhere, people were suddenly like, "That's a man," and it goes back to this.
We should say she's a cis woman.
She's a cis woman. She's not trans. She's not trans, and
who identified as a woman her entire life.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's straight up illegal to be trans in Algeria. So yeah, the Algeria would not send a trans woman to the Olympics. And so this woman is boxing. She wins her match, and everyone is just went J.K. Rowling basically kind of started the ball rolling on this. And yeah, just argued like, well, she's a man because the International Boxing Association, which is this kind of corrupt organization, had disqualified her, saying that she failed the gender test. Which the idea that there are things called gender tests is a little scary in itself. But the argument was that she maybe has XY chromosomes. She maybe has an intersex condition. We don't know that at all. There's no actual evidence to base that on. But attacking this woman who, again, has identified as a woman her whole life, she was born female, lived her whole life, grew up as a girl. Yeah, you know, and what's happening with a lot of these laws that target trans people, you know, initially, and then get used to, you know, crack down and reinforce traditional gender norms. That comes back to there was this thing published by the one of those right-wing groups. I can't remember. Focus on the Family, I think. You know, one of those awful groups, where this thing on their website talking about how to respond to the transgender movement, basically said there have been three attacks that are all connected. The first was the feminist movement. The second was the gay rights movement, and the third is the trans rights movement. So they very clearly view all these things as part of the same assault. I think they've termed it as assault on the sexes, where they want traditional gender norms. They want single income households. They want women to stay home, raise babies all day for their whole life. And the idea that someone can change their gender, that definitely throws a wrench into that. The idea that two men can be parents, that throws a wrench into that. The idea that a woman might want to work, that throws a wrench into that. And so all of these things are really tied together. And I think that is something that, in reading what the 19th put out, that I think can be really helpful, because I think a lot of people haven't really, they see stories about trans rights being attacked and they might think that's unfortunate, but they probably don't think, oh, this might affect me too. This might result in my daughter having to go through being accused of being a boy because she's tall for her age playing basketball. They might not think that. They might not think, oh, this will result in cisgender women with short hair getting questioned in bathrooms, things like that.
What's interesting to me is that they're not wrong, right? Like, those things are all connected. And what I think we're saying is, you pull on the thread of trans rights and you get to gay rights, you get to feminism. Like, they are very much correct in saying all of these things are connected. The missing revelation, the missing piece, is for progressives, or I guess Democrats, to recognize that all these things are connected. Yeah. And let's talk about the Democrats a little bit. I think there is some resistance to making trans rights a, top of mind issue, because we're having a moment where it feels like moderate voters, independent voters, perhaps former Trump voters, are being pulled into the Democratic camp. And there is the concern, like, oh no, like, if we talk about trans rights, we might lose some people.
Yes. I think that's a real fear. And I think that's something that, if you look over to the UK, that's kind of what happened with the Labour Party. They were trying to appeal to conservative voters. They were trying, so they kept kind of moving away from trans issues, not talking about trans issues. And they got to the point where they're starting to be actively hostile to trans issues, which really leaves trans people with no political party over there that really has their back. That's a little scary. That's really scary. But I think that, yeah, you see that happening over here, where I think there's this idea that if after Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, there were a bunch of op-eds that were like, she lost because she talked too much about transgender bathrooms. And the thing is, that was a bit of revisionist history. She didn't talk much about trans issues at all in 2016. It came up occasionally, and it wasn't ever like the front of her campaign. She talked about the economy a lot, but people remember, well, no, she talked about being a woman and trans issues. That's the revised history of 2016. And I think that there's this desire to kind of get away from that, to try to play down identity in a lot of ways. And I saw Nate Silver wrote something recently where he was like, it was the great thing about Kamala Harris's speech was she didn't talk about being black or being a woman much, and it's like, and that was a win for anti-wokeness or whatever. And it's just one of those things that I don't think that trans issues are as big of a liability as they think they are, but I think that people are afraid to put these issues front and center, because for years, there has been an unrelenting assault on trans rights. You know, you had when Budweiser decided to partner with Dylan Mulvaney for a single sponsored post on her Instagram. They partnered with hundreds of other influencers. She was just one of many, and people on the right found out that Budweiser had given her, you know, whatever, few $1,000s or something for this, and decided to try to tank Bud Light's stock, you know, and people freaked out and kind of got afraid. And you started to see companies start to backpedal away from this. You saw Target do it this year when it came to their Pride collection. They were very much, it was very minimal, and it was not very proud. You know, I mean, they weren't very proud of their Pride collection, I think is safe to say. And I think that applies to government as well. That applies to politics as well.
What's, I think, important to note about the Target situation is it wasn't just a corporate profit loss decision. They said, and there were instances, documented instances, of threatening employees.
Yes.
Presumably, and it doesn't even matter, cis employees.
Yes.
Like, it wasn't just about, oh, this is a bad business decision to support trans people. It was, we are threatened with violence and we want to protect our store employees, which is
it's understandable.
An understandable decision. And here's another place where I feel like Democrats could connect some dots, which is when we talk about the threat of fascism, which I do think a lot of Americans, like, that's a thing you can say that concerns people, right? Like, attacks on trans people are part of that threat. And to even abandon slightly, to just say, well, we're going to deal with that later, is a crack, you know, in the argument against fascism.
I mean, it's very similar to, you know, abortion doctors being targeted by, you know, terrorists and protesters. You know, there are a lot of doctors who provided abortions who stopped providing abortions. It's something that, you know, if you allow bullies to win, if you allow fascists to win, they're going to keep going. They're going to start terrorizing all of the people. They go from terrorizing trans people to suddenly going after the doctors who treat trans people, to going after teachers who affirm trans people, going after librarians who have books about trans people on the shelves. It doesn't stop with trans people. So that's why I think that in this election, while there's a lot at stake, I think that it's important to just kind of remember that trans people are more than just a small part of it. Trans people are the crack in the door. And, you know, I keep coming back to that, but I think it's true. If you allow them to get their foot in that crack and allow them to kind of pry it open, then it's going to, you know, the flood of fascism is going to keep going. It's going to hit them. It's going to take out more people that aren't just trans people, just trans people.
And I think it's important to note that it much in the same way that I do think a lot of the eventual, like, needing to find out who's trans ends in looking at people's genitals. Eventually, all of these attempts to repress the existence of someone, to deny that they exist, or deny their rights to bodily autonomy, to whatever it is, end in violence. And that's what you saw at Target, right? That's what you've seen. I mean, there have been bomb threats called in to, this is not theoretical. Like, there have been bomb threats called into hospitals that do gender affirming care. There haven't been anyone who's died yet.
Exactly.
And I'll point out also, I meant to point this out earlier, which is if people are like, oh, well, I don't have a trans kid. I mean, yeah, that's really bad. But I don't have a trans kid. I don't, need my kid to know about transness. I'm I feel bad about their suffering, but that doesn't affect my life.
Right.
Texas has seen an exodus of teachers. Like, there will not be enough teachers to teach children.
Yeah.
And so it will affect, you can be the most cis person. Like, you can have no truck with trans people that you know are trans. I should probably, state very clearly. And it will eventually be your kid and your family that are affected by this.
Yep.
The other thing I want to say, I forgot to say this earlier, is it's also a part of their fucking weird. Like,
yeah. That's
a weird obsession. Like,
it's a very weird obsession. People who are anti-trans think about being trans, think about trans stuff more than trans people do. That's just a fact.
And ultimately, it always ends with genital checks. Like,
yes.
There is no place that you go with policing trans people that you don't get to. We're going to have to look at their private parts. Yeah. I mean,
or in the case of the Olympics, we're going to have to DNA test you,
Or even, I think it ends with, we're going to need to look at genitals. And they're obsessed with genitals because, like, a DNA test, who knows? They could fake a DNA test. Like, we're going to just have to take a look.
So, the other day, you know how Tim Walz gave his speech at the DNC, and his son was like, "That's my dad," and like it was this heartwarming moment. So that happened.
Yeah.
Well, Megyn Kelly, formerly of Fox News and formerly of NBC, here's what she had to say on her XM radio show. She said, "It was weird for me because I saw him get up there. I saw his kids crying and clapping for him. And it was touching. It was sweet, the same way I thought it was sweet when Ashley Biden and Joe Biden hugged. And he cried when he hugged his daughter. Like, those human moments, they do tug at the heartstrings. You'd be inhuman not to." Okay, so far so good, right? And then she said, "And yet, when he started speaking, all I could think was, it's very nice that your children support you, and I'm happy for you that you have this beautiful family. However, you're literally making it as easy as possible for healthy kids to chop off their healthy body parts and sterilize themselves for life away from their loving parents, as your state allows for custodial hearings that yank them out of their loving homes so your Minnesota doctors can chop them up. I stopped feeling warm and fuzzy about that point." Like, that's a messed up thing to be like, I saw a politician talk about his family and I was immediately like, trans kids' genitals.
They think about genitals a lot. They really do. And that's not
so much.
And I know you don't, obviously, there's not a detailed conversation that needs to happen here, but that's not the point of being trans. Like, no. Genitals are actually a part, in a way that it's a part of being human, in a way that genitals are a part of the abortion, conversation, if you really want to make it about that. But trans identity is not.
Yeah. I mean, and talking
there
about
are some people who don't get surgery. There are some people who don't wind up transitioning. Let's call it, I don't know. I feel weird calling it fully. Like,
yeah. I mean, there people medically transition to different points, and to their own comfort levels. Surgery is very expensive. It's very invasive. It could be very scary. There are lots of reasons that someone might avoid it if, for some reason, their gender dysphoria isn't so bad that they would pursue that, or that they can't afford it, something like that. And this idea that there are doctors chopping up children is so just bonkers. It just makes no sense. It's something that, these surgeries are for adults, primarily. In very, very rare cases, it might be like, oh, a 17-and-a-half-year-old, before they went off to college, really wanted to have surgery, and so they did, where they're that. But this idea that there's 6-year-old, we're going to chop up this 6-year-old or this 12-year-old, All of these things are just so completely nonsense, but they sound really scary. And it becomes something that politicians then on the Democratic side have to then end up, for taking really kind of just baseline good human being stances, they then have to defend themselves against attacks that they're enabling doctors chopping up children,
And
you know?
I want to point out also, you can probably cherry pick, I won't even call it cherry pick, you can find examples of teens or maybe even preteens getting some form of gender affirming surgery even.
Sure.
But I always, or access to hormones, but I always think it's important to point out that gender affirmation is not just for trans people. That there is a possibility of a young, assigned at birth male, cis, continuing to assert as male, getting what we would call for a trans person top surgery because they have some condition that makes them develop a level of breast that is uncomfortable to have as a boy, right? Like, what the issue is here is allowing it's a bodily autonomy issue. If you as a Democrat understand that a young person, perhaps younger than 16 person, getting an abortion is a decision that they can make, that they are allowed to make, if we support a 12-year-old who has gotten pregnant being able to access reproductive care, which I do think Democrats have come to a place where that is part of the conversation, it is not too far to go.
Yeah.
To say those decisions are made between a young person and their doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah. And obviously, what's being discussed in all of this, we're not even discussing, what happens if parents aren't supportive. This is with parents who are supportive. So you've got doctors, parents, and the young person all on the same page. Why should the government come in and say no? That's kind of one of those things that there's really no good reason for the government to insert itself there. And by allowing the government to do that, you're really just opening the door to other attacks on bodily autonomy. If you let them ban puberty blockers for trans teens, what's to stop them from banning, the abortion pill? These things are all tied together.
Or banning hormone blockers for cis young people who need it because, for whatever reason, puberty is not something they're ready for. Especially for like a very young person having early puberty onset, right? Mm-hmm. What I always like to make the comparison to someone who had a what we would call a late term abortion, which that would also be a good term to get rid of. That would be a good phrase to not use. Is she pointed out to me that we trust doctors to not amputate healthy limbs. Like, there is sort of this general social agreement that doctors and patients together can make good decisions about all kinds of things, right? So how come there are these few places that we say, can't let that decision get made between a doctor and a patient and perhaps their parents, the patient's parents.
Exactly. And it's so tied together. You crack open that door. You say, well, in this one case, I'm okay with the government making decisions about healthcare. I'm okay with the government coming in and saying, no, you and your doctors can't make the call here. Whether it's saying that about, abortion, whether it's saying that about gender affirming care, as soon as you crack open that door, you open the door for them to ban whatever they want, banning birth control, banning the abortion medications, these things, they're all tied together. And if it's
It's okay. I wonder if you could talk about something that you and I have talked about, like an interpersonal conversations, which is the very real connection between politicians' resistance to engage with trans issues, resistance, I'm not going to say engage, resistance to affirmatively endorse trans issues, trans rights, not trans issues even. Let's get real specific. And the real life experience of being trans.
Yeah, I mean, it can be, it's really frustrating, honestly, to have these situations where politicians who are supposed to be on your side, who are supposed to have your back, kind of sit on the side and don't talk about this as the other party is just going state by state demolishing trans rights. And yeah, you can look and be like, well, look, the Biden administration is fighting these things in court, but they're not making a big deal about them publicly. They're quietly fighting these, bans on trans care in court, and they're not making a public case. And it takes a toll on you as a trans person to see this happening. And personally, my anxiety and my depression, which have been an issue for me for a very long time, kept getting worse and worse. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the world is very cruel to trans people, and it often feels like there aren't many people who actually have our backs, and I don't think that politicians realize, or maybe they do and they just don't care, but I don't think that they realize how much public, actually taking a public stance saying I have your back, there can mean to trans people. There was a moment, and I'll never forget it, during the Obama administration, towards the end, where the administration announced that it was going to fight North Carolina's anti-trans bill. That was back when introducing an anti-trans bill would get the entire country to go and say, we need to boycott this state. We need to pull our concerts out of the state until they do the right thing. But now it just happens and no one cares. But at the time when they were fighting this, I remember that, the Attorney General at the time, Loretta Lynch, gave a speech where she said, this administration has your back, trans people, addressing it directly to trans people. We have your back. We will fight for you. You are fine the way you are. We will not let bad things happen to you. That's that sort of messaging. And it meant so much to me just to be like, good, they see how serious this is. They see how serious this is, and they're willing to actually stand up for it. Or stand up to bullies who are trying to harm us. And now it's kind of one of those things where, when the Biden administration came in, they said one of their first 100-day priorities was going to be to try to pass and implement the Equality Act. The Equality Act, which would have provided protections for LGBTQ people generally, in employment, housing, public services, and pretty much anywhere else that the Civil Rights Act protects. It passed the House, and then it got to the Senate, and then it didn't go anywhere in the Senate, and people just kind of stopped talking about it. And it didn't get enacted in Biden's first 100 days, obviously. It's dead now. It's because it's not going to make it through the Republican House, and it doesn't have enough votes to make it through the Senate. But at the same time, it was disappointing for them to say, for for Biden to say, like, yes, this is going to be one of our big priorities, and then it just kind of didn't go anywhere. Didn't use the political capital to make it happen, to get that through, to try to get that through. Because I don't know if it would have been successful or not. But because that legislation never made it through Congress, because it was never signed into law, it opened the door for all of these state level attacks on trans people. And it's been just really sad to watch. And it's taken, I'm relatively privileged, in a lot of ways, and it's taken a massive toll on my mental health. I can't imagine what sort of toll that takes on someone who's in a less privileged position than me.
So I want to be careful not to fangirl too hard about Tim Walz. But I am so much more excited in a weird way for this like cis white guy because of a few things that he said. But the most important one he said is you accrue political capital to spend it. Like that is the purpose of winning elections, is to burn, not to accrue political capital, but to burn it.
Yes, exactly.
And that's such a revolutionary thing for a Democrat politician to say. It's something the Republicans have known and practiced.
Oh, yeah.
Is to go further than what they promised in terms of conservative ideology, right? Is to win on the life issue and then do a whole bunch of other shit that voters didn't necessarily okay, right? But because they won the election, they're going to do that too. I mean, Tim Walz has just been like, all right, we won. Let's protect trans kids.
And that's the thing. He had, it was like there was a meme that was going around that was just like Democrats with a super majority in New York, and it was just like it showed like nothing happening. It's like Democrats with a 1-seat majority in the Midwest, and it's like all of these things happening. And yeah, that's kind of the thing. It's like you get the power, you should use the power and use it for good, because when the other side wins, and they will eventually win, they're going to use it to enact what they can. What they can get away with. And if you're only you're only half-assing it when you have power, and they're going way beyond what they've promised, it's going to just keep moving the country in the wrong direction. So you've got to fight.
And what did Democrats eventually learn from the abortion debate, right? They learned you can't keep giving half measures. You can't keep opening the door and saying, you're right, late-term abortion is bad. Partial birth abortion is bad. Young people below the age of 16 getting abortions is bad, right? Like the refusal to just be strong in opposing that meant the eventual rollback of Roe versus Wade.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we've been talking about this entire conversation, but refusing to engage in a affirmative way about, and you can just include it in bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
You can just include it in the whole definition of reproductive justice, like refusing to engage informally and loudly pushing. That means you will eventually lose, because what happened with the abortion issue was that people was like, oh, I guess I'll vote for there isn't that much difference between the Republicans and Democrats on the life issue, which is again how they were able to frame it. So eventually, Republicans did win and did all this damage. And so when you said, and they win eventually, what I went to is, if you keep half measuring, or you keep being gentle, or you keep not engaging, you keep just saying you're right about some of this stuff. Tampons in boys' bathrooms is kind of no, and boys participate in girls' sports. That is something that will give you. If you keep doing that, eventually Republicans will get in power.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago at this point, I wrote something at my newsletter that was the article is called "Fine, Let's Talk About Trans Athletes," and the point that I eventually make in this piece is that none of this was about trans people competing in sports. This is all just a way to move the move the acceptable line, move what's okay to debate, because and we saw this happen. You had all these states go and they banned trans kids from sports, and then they went and they banned trans kids from medically transitioning. And then, now you have them banning trans people from using restrooms and stuff. So all of this stuff is just one step after another to try to move this. And if you have Democratic politicians going, well, we're not going to put up a fight on the sports thing because it's just sports. We're not going to push back on that because, hey, maybe there is unfairness or here or there. But, it's like what we were talking about was children participating in school sports. So it's like, it's about the purpose of that is so kids make friends and learn from each other, not so they win state championships, like I get that every parent thinks that their kid's going to go pro at whatever they're doing, but it's just like, that just doesn't happen. And that's not the purpose of school athletics.
So I do want to get personal for a second, because I told a friend of mine that I was going to be talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like a colleague, actually, I guess more than like a friend. And she was like, oh, I know who Parker Molloy is, because I heard her interviewed once while my daughter was exploring transition.
Oh.
And it meant so much to me to have like a trans person, like just being, I mean, I guess it was representation, but she sort of felt like to have someone engage on the issues, like as a trans person and talking about transness, like without shame.
I mean, that's why, that's why I do these interviews, and talk about these things, it's because it matters to me, but it matters to other people too, and I think I think it's great that interview, whatever it was helpful. And it's one of those things that I think it's helpful to see trans people just, yes, talking about trans issues, but also just talking about just life. I think that there's still this big misperception of what trans people are like, because it's all built on media narratives, and trans people generally aren't given a whole lot of space in the broader media to discuss things other than trans issues. And that is when they're even allowed into the spaces in the first place. I mean, the New York Times, there was something that Media Matters did an analysis on, found that in something like 2/3 of their coverage of anti-trans bills, they didn't quote a single trans person in the articles. So yeah, I think that there is representation does matter in that sense.
Parker, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Parker's newsletter is The Present Age and covers trans stuff and a lot of media criticism. And I know you're also a fan of cute animals.
I am. I have 2 of them.
Named?
One is named Tater Tot, and he looks like a crispy little tater tot. The other one is named Casserole, and she is kind of chonky, so it works out.
I'm just a big fan of animals named after foodstuffs. I don't know why, and my cats and dog are not. All of my animals are named after alcoholic writers, which, in retrospect, was a bad idea, but I did it anyway. Next time, toast. Next time, donut. Anyway, I am Ana Marie Cox. This is 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We're on day 69.
Nice.
Thank you for doing that, Parker.
Thanks.
If you are watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe and share. Share as well. If you are listening to this podcast, know that we are also available on YouTube, and we would appreciate you liking, subscribing, sharing, and rating and reviewing. This is a countdown to the election. It is day 69. Tomorrow is day 68, and we'll do another show.
It's not about banking political capital for the next election. It's about burning political capital to improve lives.